Hello again, my friends, and welcome once more to the Invisible College. Now, if you are new here, double welcome. I've noticed that we're getting quite a few new people coming along to watch these videos, and that's fantastic. You've come to the right place. If you are interested in forgotten history or ancient mysteries, you've come to the right place, and I've got hundreds of lectures on YouTube for you to pick around in if you want. But this series is focused on the forgotten history of Britain, and there's, I think, 3 other lectures before this one, so you might like to watch those as well. You don't have to watch all these in order, but it will help if you do. So, okay, the Forgotten History of Britain series, and this one is called Sir William Flinders Petrie and Britain's Neglected Past. If you don't know who William Flinders Petrie is, you'll find out as we go on. Now, we talked about Geoffrey of Monmouth, and I have this book. Many of you will have read it. It's called A History of the Kings of Britain. It was first published in 1136. And in the previous lecture I talked about this, and I talked about Geoffrey himself, and I talked about the situation as it was politically and socially in Britain at the time when he was writing. And it was 1136, is quite early on in the Norman period. It's just after the third of the Norman kings had died, Henry I. So it's a critical date, and I've discussed all that in the previous lecture. But Geoffrey of Monmouth, he tells us how he was given an old book by his superior, who's called Walter, and he's known to history as Walter Calenius, not to be confused with Walter Map, who was another Walter who came a generation later. So Walter Calenius, he was the Archdeacon of Oxford at the time. It's a very high position. It means he's in charge of running the university, basically. And he gave an old book to Geoffrey, written in the Welsh language. He calls it the Old British language, and said, "Can you translate this for me into Latin," which was the general Latin, the language of scholarship at the time. People weren't speaking English in those days. You could translate things into French, but Latin was the lingua franca of the whole Western Europe. So Geoffrey says, sure, and he did a translation, but it's, as he calls it, it's a flowery style. He elaborates on stories. He adds colour to them. It's a bit like he's been given a set of black and white prints, and he's coloured them in to give them more passion, more flavour. And that's what he's done with these old texts when he's done his translation. And bestseller, of its day. We discussed all that in the previous lecture. In this one, I want to focus on whether there really was an old book and what that book was and what we may learn more about this ancient history without the flowers and the bells and whistles that Geoffrey puts on it, and if it really is something that we should take seriously, because it could be very, very important for us. Does our history start with the Roman conquest effectively and everything else before that is just archaeology? Or do we have a written history that goes back in time before the Romans, which is what would seem to be the case if these scripts, this book existed? And so that's very important for us, because without an actual written history, you don't know who's who and what, who was doing what, when, why. So you might find an archaeological site, but you can only talk in generalizations about it. You can say the person who lived here must have been high status or something like that. Well, you don't know who they were, They might have been a king, they might have been someone in the history. You have no clue. And so having an actual written history, even if it's defective, gives you a starting point at least for delving back in and finding about actual people and motives, why they may have been doing certain things, how certain things you find in the landscape actually came about. For instance, why did they build hill forts? You can begin to go into those when you realise about the different invasions and things like that that were going on. So there is importance for us to get into this if we are, like me, interested in ancient history. And I should add that my passion about this really was reignited when I met Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett, to whom I've dedicated this series, and we wrote together this book here, The Holy Kingdom, and some of what I'm going to be telling you in later lectures is going to be deriving from the studies done in here by Alan and Baron, but other ones are going to be things that I've researched since then, or that I've looked at rather differently from how they did. So this book's out of print at the moment. I don't know if it's ever going to come back into print, so I might see if we can do something about that. But that remains to be seen. So that's the situation. Now then, I'm going to start off, we're going to talk about Geoffrey himself. So I've got some notes I've written up here to help me. Excuse me if I'm reading from the screen at times. It's because I want to get things right. I don't want to just waffle away and not give you the right details. So Geoffrey of Monmouth was born in 1095 and died in 1155. So that's quite an important period of history, as I say. It covered a period when we had a civil war here. He is famous for writing Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain, which was published in 1136. As we have discussed, this was a critical year in the history of Norman England. Henry I had died in early December 1135, and within 3 weeks his nephew Stephen had managed to get himself crowned as the new king in Westminster. This was to provoke a civil war known as the Anarchy. And Geoffrey was neither ignorant nor disinterested in the succession. No, you can bet he wasn't. I think everyone was interested in what was going to happen. His chief dedicatee was the most powerful baron in Britain, Henry's eldest but illegitimate son, Robert Fitzroy, generally known to history as Robert the Consul or Robert Earl of Gloucester. So this Robert was also the Lord of Glamorgan, and as such was effectively king himself in this part of Wales. I should add here that because he had conquered, Wales was outside of England at that time. It was not a part of England. So the Normans had conquered England, but Wales was something separate. So the invasion of Wales by Robert, he captured these lands, and he'd done it by his own hand, not under the guidance or orders of the king. So it was then, he was now the lord, Palatine lord, over this territory, which made him effectively a little king within that part of Wales. His other territories in England, he had to give fealty to the king for. So he was a subordinate in England, but in Wales he was the boss, at least of the part that he controlled. His mother was a Welsh princess, and so for Welshmen such as Geoffrey, he, that's Robert, represented the possibility of restoring a Welsh king on the throne of England. And I've mentioned this at the last lecture also, that because he's the eldest son of Henry I, if he could have gone for it. He could have said, right, Stephen, get off that throne. I'm the king's son. I'm taking over. And he's the most powerful baron in Britain. He would have had quite a lot of support. But in the event, he didn't choose to do that. And so that didn't happen. This seems likely to have been Geoffrey's motive, well, one of them. for translating the Welsh annals into Latin and dedicating his book to Robert. So I should say that what we're looking at here is the brutes. The word brute, B-R-U-T, is commonly applied to annals, and what an annal is a yearly record. It's like a diary entry, and every nation, certainly the British were doing this, and so were the Anglo-Saxons later on. You would keep a record, of major events of the year, of that year, like a diary. But they're called brutes because they start off with someone called Brutus, or Brute. They don't put the US on in Welsh or in English. It should be called Brute. The US is a Latin thing added on to decline a word. So the brutes begin with Brute. They begin with Brutus, who was the first king in this British lineage from before Roman times, who claimed to be descended from the kings of Troy. But we'll go into that much later. So that's why they call these brutes. And we'll be coming across one called the Brut Tysilio shortly. Geoffrey's first major critic, now you have to understand, when he first brought out this book, it was very well received, and it actually still is and has been throughout history, mainly because it contains the first proper account of King Arthur and the whole Arthurian thing that came after that, the Arthurian romances, French romances, German romances, Italian, everything. Stems originally from the fact that this book was published. But he also had his critics, and the first major critic to come out of the woodwork, as it were, was a guy called William of Newburgh. Newburgh is another name for Newbury. Newbury, we would call it today, is in Berkshire. It's on the M4 if you're interested. So he must have been born in Newbury. And he was born in 1136, so that's actually the same year as Geoffrey published his book, 1136. Known as Little William, that's William Parver, he wrote a history of the period from the accession of Stephen in 1136, and that's William Parver's birthday, and covering the reign of Henry II, who died in 1189, and nearly all of the reign of Richard I, who died in 1199. Richard I, of course, is Richard the Lionheart. So to put this into context, William of Newburgh lived in the era of Robin Hood, Prince John, and the Sheriff of Nottingham. So that gives us a sort of a period of history to think about, of robber barons and corrupt Prince John as regent of England while Richard is away fighting crusades, and the doughty yeoman of Robin Hood who takes from the rich and gives to the poor. That's the kind of ambience we perhaps could be thinking about here. That's the time of William of Newburgh. He would have lived in that sort of period. So William of Newburgh, or Newbury, put the boot into Geoffrey. Concerning Geoffrey, he wrote, "Only a person ignorant of ancient history would have any doubt about how shamelessly and impudently he lies in almost everything." Geoffrey, long dead by this time, had no means of replying to this calumny and attack on the veracity of old Welsh history. So poor old Geoffrey, he's rotting away in his tomb, wherever he was buried, and this upstart, William of Newbury, comes up and says, he's a liar. You can't believe that. Nobody in their right mind believes this. And this is very much the attitude of academia today, and ever since, or certainly since the 18th century, towards Geoffrey of Monmouth and this old Welsh history. They don't like it. They think it's rubbish. They think it's garbage. They think he was a liar, cheat, inventor. All of these, this is piled on this poor old man's head. And actually, you know, he was a monk doing the job he'd been asked to do. Well, he tells us exactly what he was told to do. Take this old book, which I've got from Brittany, translate it from the British language, which is Welsh, into Latin. And he does that, and he does it in a way that's going to make a bestseller. What's wrong with that? But academia have a way of sneering at anyone who's not one of them. And poor old Geoffrey caught it in the neck. You know, he couldn't answer back. Never mind that he was a bishop at the end of his life. They treat him as if he was some kind of, I don't know, gypsy fortune teller or something. He wasn't. He was a man of Oxford, and he was translating history. He probably wrote other books that we don't know about. But there we go. That's life for you. Now, the main reason for this attack was that little William was a major admirer of the 7th century English monk we call the Venerable Bede. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the Venerable Bede. He is still very much venerated, the Venerable Bede. His most famous work is called The Ecclesiastical History of the English Church, right? He grew up, I should say, before I go into the next bit, the English Church only dates from 597, when St. Augustine landed in Kent and came to Canterbury to the court of King Ethelbert, who was the Anglo-Saxon king of Kent. And Ethelbert was married to a French wife who was a Christian. And so Augustine was invited there, probably, and he was sent by the Pope, and he converted the king of Kent to Christianity. So Ethelbert became a Christian. Kent became the first Christian kingdom in England. And that's the date of the start of the English church, as opposed to the British church, which was Welsh, right? Long before that. So when he's writing, the Venerable Bede, writing his history of the English church, it starts then. And Bede grew up just after the Synod of Whitby, which took place in 664, which had tried to reconcile the church founded by St. Columba, I'm sorry to throw all these names at you, with a branch at Lindisfarne, and he wanted to reconcile that with Roman Catholicism. So just to put that in context, St. Columba, or Columkill as he's known, Columba means dove. So does Colum in Irish. And Columkill, who came from Donegal in Northern Ireland, went to Scotland. He set up a church in Iona, it's a small island off the coast of Scotland. And he began, the Scots had come from Ireland themselves. They were already Christian. So he went there, I suppose, mainly to administer to the Scots at first, who were living in the islands and part of Argyll next to the coast there. And it's very close to Ireland, you know, Northern Ireland itself. So there'd be a lot of traffic between them. And we think of Iona and those islands as being very remote. I live in Kent, and the island of Iona is quite hard for me to get to. But for them, they were in boats all the time. And the sea was like a highway for them. And so they're moving around all those islands and the coastlands just next to it in Argyll. So that was their kingdom of Scotland at the time. He went there and he then set about converting the Picts, who were the ancient Britons who hadn't been in the Roman Empire. They were at the northern part of Scotland, and they were still pagans. And he started converting them. And that's actually where you get the story of, what they call it, the Loch Ness Monster. You've all heard of the Loch Ness Monster. Well, that goes back to Columbkill, who went to Inverness, which was the kingdom of where the king lived of the Picts. And there a sea monster comes out of the sea, and he rebukes it and sends it back. And his Christian power overcomes this diabolical beast sent to stop him doing what he's going to do. It's probably a mythological thing, talking about the pagan dragon that's kind of opposing this Christian missionary who's come there to bring the light of Christ to them. And he rebukes it and sends it back, and it goes away. That's the origin, really, of the Loch Ness Monster. Of course, these days, everyone wants to see, is there a dinosaur, a plesiosaur or something hiding down under a big sea snake or something? Well, let's see if we can get a picture. That's great for tourism in the area, but it's not the real story of what that's all about. It's actually about the confrontation between Christianity and paganism in that part of Scotland. Anyway, that's a digression. Yes. The Church of Columba was itself an offshoot from Ireland, where the church was founded by St. Patrick. Now, you've all heard of St. Patrick of Ireland, St. Patrick's Day, in parades in New York. Everyone puts on green, they wear shamrock, and they celebrate being Irish. Well, actually, St. Patrick was Welsh. He came from South Wales. He came from Glamorgan. He was originally captured by pirates, Irish pirates. So there were Irish pirates raiding the coast of Britain at the time, and he was taken away to Ireland. And sometime later, he either escaped or he was released. And he came back to Britain and got on there for a bit, and then he decided he was going to go and convert the Irish. So he went back there, and so St. Patrick becomes the patron saint of Ireland, because he does, as Columbkill does with the Picts, he converts the Irish, drives out the snakes. Well, that's again the same kind of legend as the Loch Ness Monster, driving out the pagans, the pagan imagery to do with snake worship. He drives that out. There's no snakes in Ireland anymore. Well, actually, there are physical snakes in Ireland, but it's really talking in symbolic terms about casting out the devil, casting out the demons. And that's what St. Patrick does when he goes to Ireland and he casts out the snakes. Anyway, so he was Welsh. So this whole tradition goes from Wales to Ireland to Scotland, and then the Church of Iona that Columba founded goes to Northumbria on the other side of England, off the Northumbrian coast. There was an island or group of islands there called Lindisfarne, and they found another centre of Columban type Christianity there. So there's a conflict between Roman Catholicism and this Columba-based church called the Chaldee Church of Scotland and Lindisfarne. So this is what the Council of Whitby is all about. And when you read about it in various, present-day historical documents, they'll talk all about the redating of Easter. They had different ways of calculating Easter, and the different tonsures that they had. The Latin way, you have I could have either, couldn't I? But they shave the middle part of the head, and in the Celtic way, they shave from ear to ear for the monks. But there's obviously a lot more to it than that. It's really about a power trip. It's about, do you look at the Pope as being the number one, numero uno? He is Peter's successor. Jesus said, I'm on Peter, I'll build my church. He's a successor to Peter. Therefore, he's the foundation stone of the church. Well, the Welsh and the Irish and the other people maybe had a rather different opinion about that. They had their own church thing going and didn't really ascribe to that. So there wasn't not a meeting of minds. And Bede lived for most of his life in Jarrow, which is not far from Newcastle. In other words, he lived not that far from Northumbria. He lived in Northumbria, not far from Lindisfarne. He'd seen all this. And William of Newborough's own roots were in East Yorkshire, which is just a little south from Northumbria, but also faces the North Sea. So, he's a good Roman Catholic too. And he wants, he looks upon the poor old Bede, and just before Bede, the Council of Whitby, and these awful, awful people who are adhering to this Columban type Christianity, which comes from Ireland. Oh, horror, horrors. And it originally originates from these decadent Welsh people who don't know the right truth. They're not to be trusted, these ignorant Welsh who have their own church and churches, and they're not adhering to the right faith and looking to the Pope for their guidance, etc., etc., etc. So he's taking on in the 12th century all these things that were going on in the 7th century, which was very much tied in with what had happened in Northumbria. And I'm going to read you out something. Well, before I do that, William reflected this innate Anglo-Saxon prejudice against the ancient church of the British. He was not interested in what the Welsh, who after all had inhabited Britain from long before the Roman invasion of 43 AD, had to say about the history of the island. Prior to that, he didn't care a toss about that. These ignorant savages who have their own decadent, heretical version of Christianity, not to be trusted in any way, and don't even let them get a foot in the door with this book of Geoffrey's. Cast it out, cast out that devil. He's not to be dealt with. Unfortunately, William's attack stuck. Geoffrey's book, while still very popular, was relegated to the status of historical fiction rather than history. There's something else I want to read out to you that has a bearing on all of this. And that is, we have another chronicle here. This is called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which was begun at the time of King Alfred the Great of Wessex, who was a great Anglo-Saxon king. And actually he called in as his advisor a Welsh bishop called Asa, Bishop of St. David's. In Wales, Asa, it comes from the French word azure, meaning blue. And see, he's known as the Blue Bard in Wales. And he was a bard, and he knew a lot about annals and about history and about genealogies. All this has been lost. People in Alfred's day, prior to him, couldn't understand Latin. The Anglo-Saxons, the majority of them. I'd say vast majority. The clergy, the old British clergy, had been either pushed out or run away to Wales, and the Anglo-Saxons were pagans. And although they had been Christianized, they didn't know about journals and all of that. And Asa was invited to Alfred's court to teach him Latin, but also to help him to compile a history of his kingdom, which he did. And that forms the basis of the earlier part of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And there's a very important part here that I want to find for us, if I can. Yes. Now, there was a Welsh king, yes, he was still considered to be the king of Britain at the time, called Cadwallon. And when you read Geoffrey's book, he's got quite a lot to say about Cadwallon. But Cadwallon, is a battle leader. Cad means battle in Welsh. So he's Wallon means a leader. He's a leader in battle. He's what his real name is, we don't know, or I don't anyway. But anyway, Cadwallon formed an alliance with a king called Penda, and Penda was the king of Mercia. Mercia was an English kingdom in the on the borders of Wales, you could say in the Midlands area, and they formed an alliance, and together they attacked Northumbria, which was this Christian kingdom on the North Sea coast, but they bordered on to parts of Mercia. So we get here Edwin the king, that's the king of Northumbria at the time, and this is since 633 AD. Edwin the king was killed by Cadwalla and Penda at Hatfield Chase on October the 14th. He reigned for 17 years, and his son Osfrith was killed with him. So the father and the son are both killed. Afterwards, Cadwallon and Penda went and ravaged all the land of Northumbria. So we have there's two kings, this alliance of this North Welsh and the Mercians ravaging. Actually, I think Cadwallon was king of all of the Wales, or all the British. They're ravaging Northumbria, which was a very wealthy place at the time. So they ravaged all the lands of Northumbria. When Paulinus, he's a bishop, saw that, he took Ethelburg, Edwin's widow, and went by ship to Kent. Eadbald and Honorius received him very honourably and gave him the bishopric at Rochester. There he lived until his end. So effectively, the Christian religion had been stamped out in Northumbria. And you can imagine how the Northumbrians felt about that, and how they felt about the Christian Welsh, who had allied with these pagans. Penda was a pagan, to ravage Northumbria and drive out its bishop, who had to flee to Kent, which was still obviously Christian. The Kent missionaries had converted them in the first place, and he became Bishop of Rochester. So actually we have some evidence for all of this, because they made an amazing discovery in Shropshire, I think in the 2008 or sometime like that. They found this amazing golden hoard. It's the most valuable treasure ever found in Britain, and it's Anglo-Saxon gold. And it's all things broken up. There's pommels from swords, there's pieces of crosses, and all sorts of stuff like that. So we can imagine that Penda and his men, they looted Northumbria, taking all this gold and stuff, this treasure, the carnets, and breaking up crosses and taking those back to his kingdom of Mercia, and it got buried there. Perhaps they were going to come back later and retrieve it, but they never did. So this is this scenario of history that Bede has grown up in after this, and he's obviously he doesn't like the Welsh and doesn't have nice things to say about them, and that rubbed off on William of Newburgh, and I think fortified his attack on Geoffrey's book. So afterwards, after William's attack stuck, Geoffrey's book, while still very popular, is relegated to the status of historical fiction rather than history. And that's sort of where it remains today. Yeah, you can't trust the Welsh. They invent things, they don't know what they're talking about. Well, these people had the bardic tradition, which went back thousands of years. They're the ones that taught Alfred how to do annals and taught him Latin. He then later wrote in Latin. They preserved a Christian religion in Wales, and there are all sorts of inscribed stones and inscribed this and that. Ancient churches founded by very early saints in Wales. You don't find that in England. Yeah, you start trying to look for 6th century or 4th century stones, inscribed stones in England, you won't find them. They're in Wales. Anyway, that's another story. And Geoffrey's case was not helped by his style of writing. No, it wasn't. While he has indeed translated the ancient annals of Wales into Latin, he had also made them more fun to read by adding details not found in the original texts. Thus he added descriptions that he thought were appropriate for the characters he was talking about. The women became beautiful, the men tall and handsome, and so on. And he also attributed emotional response to events. So the annals are very bald statements. So-and-so did this, then he did that, and then he died, and then so-and-so came. They're very bald, rather dry statements in the main, and he gives them more colour. In this way, what were simple annals or yearly entries into the national diary were enlarged into a more colourful version of British history. Is this lying? Is this lying? I don't think so. I think it's just a style, of elaborating. And all historians do this in one way or another. They have to. They're trying to work out people's motives, and it's a bit like detective work, You've got to work out what someone's motive is and who done it, And who done it, you need to know what their motive was or could have been for doing it. And did they have the opportunity? And did they have the means? I think these are things you have to know if you're going to be a detective. Inspector Clouseau or, perhaps Inspector Morse would be more appropriate in this day and age. I don't know. He was from Oxford, by the way. The truth or not of Geoffrey's tales rests on whether or not he really was given an old book by his mentor, Walter Carlenius, Archdeacon of Oxford. For many years it was assumed that such a book, if it had ever existed, had been lost. Well, that was true, isn't it? But in the late 18th century, a text was found in another old Welsh book, now known as the Red Book of Hergest. Hergest was I think it's an abbey, certainly a place in Wales. These books all have names: White Book of this, Black Book of that, Red Book of something else. These books that contain these very ancient manuscripts. So this very large MS manuscript was compiled by copying a number of earlier manuscripts. It contains the Mabinogion. The Mabinogion, you probably heard of the Mabinogion. They're Welsh children's stories, translated, I think, by Lady Charlotte Guest, who came from Merthyr Tydfil. Welsh poems known as triads. The thief of this, the three great men who did this, or the three marvellous retinues, or whatever it is that there are three of. And then they say the one did this, the second did that, and the third did that. That's how they used to write their poems. And this triadic style was actually done that way because it makes memorizing those events much easier if you have this certain rhythm to the poem, and if you have it always the three of this, the three of that. Because the bards would learn these poems by heart. They wouldn't rely on writing them down, and many of these weren't written down until the Middle Ages. So that's one reason why they say, they're just invented, they're just these imaginary Welsh, I can't trust them. Well, they had a bardic tradition stretching back thousands of years, and every country had this at one time. The bards, or the equivalent, would learn the stories, and they'd tell the tales, and they'd recite the poems and sing the songs. That was their culture. And we still see that in Wales today. It's a land of song, isn't it? It's a land of poetry. They still do it. It's in the blood. The very large MS was compiled by copying a number of earlier MSs. Yeah, I said all that. Welsh poems known as the triads add a text analogous to Geoffrey's history. So there is a text in there that's analogous to Geoffrey's history. The Red Book of Hergest is thought to have been written about 1382. So that's not long after all of these other people. what, 150 years after the death of Geoffrey, something like that. It has been an eventful, it's had an eventful life, but in 1701 it was donated to Jesus College, Oxford, which retains ownership to this day. And Jesus College itself was founded in 1577 by Elizabeth I, so it's the only college that Elizabeth founded. Its original purpose was to train priests for the Anglican Church in Wales. They don't call it the Church of England in Wales, it's called the Church in Wales. It was soon the Welsh College of Oxford, and prior to the foundation of the University of Wales at Aberystwyth, that was only in the 19th century, was where Welsh scholars went for a university education. So to go to Jesus College, you needed to be Welsh. It's not like that now. They're open to everyone now, all over the world. They have to be, don't they? There's too much competition for Welsh people going to other universities in Wales or to other colleges in England, other universities. So, it's egalitarian now. But in the old days, it was the Welsh College in Oxford. And the college owns many rare Welsh manuscripts, including the famous Jesus College 20 manuscript with its important genealogies. Now, we'll be talking about that one in later lectures. The two major manuscripts, the Harleian 3859, which is in the British Library, and the Jesus College 20 manuscript, which actually is kept at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. They have this deal. The Bodleian looks after these precious manuscripts now. The Red Book of Hergest went pretty much unnoticed until 1801, when parts of it were published in a seminal work called Myfynian Archaeology of Wales. This book, now rare, was reprinted along with additional material in 1870. Unfortunately, because it is all in Welsh, it remains a closed book for all but Welsh speakers, who are few and far between in England, and even in Wales are a small minority. However, it contains a historical text from the Red Book of Hergest. Now, Alan Wilson had a copy of Myfynian. The F should be pronounced V in Welsh, so it's the Myfynian Archaeology. He had a copy of that, all in Welsh. Now, he knew a little bit of Welsh, but not that much, I think. I don't think he knew enough to be able to read that book without the help of a dictionary next to him. But he certainly had a copy of it. I don't know what's happened to it now. I hope it wasn't destroyed in the fire. Anyway, there we go. The general belief of academia, based on a colophon, that's something written onto a manuscript, on another text, is that Walter Carlenius, Geoffrey's senior, having given his old book in the British tongue to Geoffrey, amused himself by translating Geoffrey's book back into Welsh. I don't know what you think, but I think that's pushing it too far. This is an obvious nonsense. In actuality, the text is quite different and would have to be a précis of Geoffrey's text, which we know was an expansion of the original. Yeah, I haven't read the Welsh text in the Red Book of Hergest, so I'm on thin ice here. But I think the idea that Walter Carlenius would then take Geoffrey's book and amuse himself by translating it from the Latin back into Welsh is laughable. I mean, if he knew Welsh that well, he would have translated it himself. He wouldn't have asked Geoffrey to do it. He wouldn't have needed to, would he? And hasn't he got better things to do than to take Geoffrey's flowery Latinized text and turn that back into a flowery Latinized version of a Welsh book that already exists? It doesn't make sense to me. In fact, we have no evidence that Walter was Welsh. We don't know where Walter came from. We don't know that he's Welsh or even knew Welsh. What we do know is that Walter was a historian. Ah, that's important. And that he had an important place in Oxford. Yeah, he was the Archdeacon of Oxford. A lot of people would be coming to him, you know, he's the man, you know. What is much more likely is that he came by many books and manuscripts that people wanted to sell him. Yeah, so I don't believe he even went to Brittany. We've got no evidence of that other than saying that this is an old Welsh text that he brought back from Brittany. Well, we have no other evidence for that. I can imagine there were people coming, Welsh people, coming to Oxford with manuscripts that were worth a pretty penny. And they would find the man is Walter Collinius, and go to him and say, look, I've got this manuscript here, written in Welsh, it's very, very old. Would you be interested in buying it? And he pays out a few guineas or whatever it was the going rate. It's a bit like Egypt when, you know, Howard Carter's there and people are flogging off papyruses, many of them in the British Museum now, and other places, that they're tomb robbers, robbing tombs and finding things and taking them out and selling them. That was going on rampant in the 18th and 19th centuries in Egypt, and to some extent into the 20th century. It still probably goes on now, but we can imagine something a bit similar in Wales, that people have these manuscripts in their libraries, or they steal them from someone else's library and take them to Oxford to sell. And that's how I think Walter came by this book, but I might be wrong. This one was written in Welsh, and so he asked Geoffrey to translate it into Latin. He didn't know what he's got. He can't read it. You know, what I got here is, yeah, Jeff, I can't read this. You know Welsh. Translate it for me, will you? He wants to know what it is. And this way, he and other historians would be able to read it. So he wants to read the book. Wouldn't you just? I would want to read the book if I were him. And that's the way you do it. You get someone to translate it for you. Now then, in 1811, a book was published called The Chronicle of the Kings of Britain. It was in English and was translated from the Welsh copy attributed to Tysilio. Now, that book was, it's a very, very rare book. I think it was reprinted about 1862, was it? 1867, something like that. But even so, it's very, very rare. Now, extraordinarily, Allen and Barham had a copy of that book. And they made a photocopy of it for me, which I have here. And here you can see it. I have got the full photocopy of it. And I've used that for my studies. It is actually available now. You can actually buy it reprinted. I don't know if the reprint is absolutely truthful. I hope it is. You can also download it off the internet for free from the Gutenberg, Project Gutenberg. In actuality, the Brut Tysilio was translated from a Welsh text contained in another book called the Black Book of Basingwork Abbey. Yeah, I said they're called red or black or white books. White Book of Lanark, I think, is another one. And the Black Book of Basingwork Abbey, augmented by several other texts of the same thing. The Basingwork text was the most complete, and the others were used to supplement it or offer alternatives. So we call it the Brut Tysilio, but it's actually derived from several texts, of the same thing. Now, Tysilio himself was a monk and later bishop, and he was alive in the 640s. So it's surmised that Tysilio had added the last part of the Brut to an existing chronicle that had come down to him. And he lived during the time of a great plague, when many Welsh nobles fled to Brittany, taking prized possessions with them. Aha! In this way, the Welsh or British chronicle attributed to his pen, that's Tysilio, was likely taken to Brittany too, and this could be what supplied the contents of the very old book that Walter Carlenius acquired and asked Geoffrey to translate. I say the contents of because I don't think we should be thinking there was only one old book. These histories would be copied. There would be a number of copies, some of them with bits of continuation perhaps, or minor mistakes or changes. So even in those days there would be more than one, but we can think that the book that he brought back, or was brought back and brought to him in Oxford by someone who wanted to flog it, was only one of these books. Thus, while we don't have the book itself, we do seem to have several transcriptions of it in Welsh, the best being that in the Black Book of Basingwork. So this is, I think, the genesis of the whole thing. There is this text, standard text of the Welsh annals, which are known, were known in Brittany, and at least one copy of it came back to Wales and from there to Oxford, and were translated in his flowery way by Geoffrey of Monmouth. So this is what we need to think about. But calling it the Brut Tysilio, we may as well. You've got to call it something. And Robert's book was republished. That's the Reverend Robert's book here, the Brut Tysilio. It's republished in 1862, but very few people knew of its existence. Then it, by fortuitous means, came to the attention of Britain's foremost archaeologist of the day, William Flinders Petrie. Now, you must have heard of Flinders Petrie. You must have heard of Flinders Petrie. I mean, he's the man. He's the man for Egyptology and archaeology. He was a professor of London University, held the first seat of Egyptology. He was a collector of Egyptian objects, and the Petrie Museum he sold all his stuff to the University of Oxford London when he retired, and they set up the Petrie Museum. You can go there, you can go and see all his stuff. He carried out the first systematic digs in Egypt, recording everything, using cameras and recording the stratigraphy of the different layers and looking at the pottery in different layers and using this technique of matching pottery from different places to give you a rough timeline for when those things were constructed. He constructed a timeline based on Manetho, the Egyptian scribe writing in a librarian, I think in the 3rd century AD, I think. And Manetho gives you the king list set into dynasties. Unfortunately, we don't have Manetho's own book. We only have transcripts taken from it, epitomes. But there's quite a lot there, and he used that to set up the whole situation where we had the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, all these different dynasties that we still use today. Maybe some changes to it and modifications, but he's the guy who set all that up. He did a major survey of Giza, which is still very accurate even now. So anyway, he was a great man. So in 1917, Petrie read a paper to the members of the British Academy, of which he was also a fellow. Petrie was a fellow of the British Academy. He did a lot of stuff that was of interest to them, particularly on philology, which is the study of language. He made some amazing discoveries. The Sinaitic script. He did digs in the Sinai Peninsula, and he found this text, very, very ancient text, which seems to be the first proto-alphabetic text in the world. This guy was something else. He's the man. So he comes along in 1917 and he delivers a lecture to the members of the British Academy. And I have the transcript of the lecture here. And it's called Neglected British History. And it focuses on the Brut Tysilio, believe it or not. And I'm going to read out to you the beginning of this. Again, this you can download, and I'll put the link below here. So if you're interested, you can download it and read his own words. Don't take my word for it. Read what he actually had to say and what he lectured at the British Academy. By anyone reading the best modern authorities on history, it would hardly be expected that the fullest account that we have of early British history is entirely ignored. While we may see a few and contemptuous references to Nennius or Gildas, the name of the so-called Tysilio's chronicle is never given, nor is any use made of its record. Yet it is of the highest value, for, as we shall see further on, the internal evidence shows that it is based on British documents extending back to the 1st century. So he's saying that these documents go back to at least the 1st century AD. The best MS of it appears to be in the book of Basingwork, and he quotes W.F. Skene for Ancient Books of Wales. Skene was a Scottish historian of the 19th century who did a lot of work both on Scottish and on Welsh history, early British history, and I think on some Irish as well. He again was a major figure of that time, and you can download that for Ancient Books of Wales as well if you want. It was printed in Welsh in the Mavinian Archaeology. Now, apparently that's not actually correct. It's not the Tysilio document that's in the Mavinian Archaeology. It's another one which is, they think, is translated back from Geoffrey of Monmouth, but I don't know. I don't read Welsh, so I can't say. It was translated into Peter Roberts and published in 1811. So he's saying the Brut Tysilio was translated by Reverend Peter Roberts, we discussed that, and published in 1811, and a second edition in 1862. So, that's not that long ago, really, is it? This translation is now so rare that I cannot hear of any obtainable copy, and could only work on it by having one of the British Museum copies typewritten. So he had to get hold of this book in the British Museum. And the library, the British Library used to be kept in the British Museum. Sir John Race, who had edited the Welsh, had never heard of an English translation, but found a copy of the first edition in the Bodleian, when I inquired of him. There is no mention of this chronicle or use of it by the Encyclopaedia Britannica. S.R. Gardiner, C.I. Elton, J.R. Green, Rice Holmes, in his study of Caesar, Haverfield in the Cambridge Medieval History, nor in the great collections of the Monumenta Historia Britannica. Even Dr. Hodgkin, when discussing both Geoffrey, who copied from Tysilio, and also the Brecon Brut, from which Tysilio originates, ignores Tysilio, as also do the recent studies of Baldwin Brown, Munro Chadwick, T.W. Shaw, J.W. Jerdwin, E. McClure, and Henry Sharp. These must have all been people who had been heard of in 1917. We haven't a clue I haven't anyway, who they were. So he's saying here, we have this history, this amazing history, Tysilio, and you all ignored it. Even when it's been translated into English for you, you ignore it. You don't even mention it in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. It's like it would have no Wikipedia entry today. And just as with things like Wikipedia, one reason for that might well be politics. It was not politically correct to talk about Welsh history in this way, to say it was genuine, that it was to be taken seriously. It was not politically correct because Britain, from 1700 onwards, and particularly in the 19th century, was trying to unite the island, all the islands of Britain together. Wales, Ireland, Scotland, England as one. Petrie demonstrated that this account was not, as might be expected, a rehashing of Caesar's story, but rather something entirely different. It added details that are missing in Caesar, while omitting many of Caesar's major ones. So the Tysilio document for that period, it covers a long period of history, but there is a chapter dealing with Julius Caesar and his attempted invasion of Britain. It gives very different story to the whole business from what Caesar tells us. Caesar wrote his own version. It's in De Bello Gallica. It's a sort of sideline. He's discussing his awful invasion of Gaul when he ended up killing something. Millions of people died as a result of Caesar in Gaul. But then he crossed over to Britain thinking he'd get some booty there, and he got a bloody nose instead. So he came back and pretended he had had a victory. What it becomes clear when you put the Caesar's account here and you put the Tysilio account there, and you read the two together, it's very clear that they're from different viewpoints. Caesar's account is written from the Roman viewpoint. It's politically correct. He's sending these as journal entries back to Rome, as he didn't write them as a whole book at once. He was writing his own journals and sending them to Rome as part of his publicity. And the British account is written from a British point of view. So they might be talking about the same battle, but the British don't know what's going on behind the lines with the Romans, and the Romans don't know what's going on behind the lines with the British. They're ignorant of each other's plans and tactics and a lot that each are doing. And Petrie highlights this, and he shows particularly things like Caesar goes into raptures describing the way the British used chariots. He'd never been involved in chariot warfare before. Those things had gone out with the Trojan War in the Middle East and Rome, the Mediterranean world. People didn't use chariots in warfare in the Roman period. But the Brits were still doing so in their cold island in the north. And he was discovering how powerful chariots are in battle, that they have the mobility of cavalry but the staying power of infantry. And they could gallop up and fire a few arrows and throw a few spears and then gallop off again. He was learning what chariot warfare was all about. There's nothing about that in the British account because to them that was just normal. You know, it's no more than describing fighting with a sword. That's just how you did things. You used chariots, didn't you? So it was very clear, putting these accounts together, that they're dealing with the same events seen from different perspectives, and it was clear that the Brits had their own account recorded, and they kept that, and that had stayed and become part of this larger document that we now call the Brut Tysilio. And I put it down there. Petrie's paper is available online, so I'll not go into it any further here. Yeah, you can download it, find out all his arguments. It's quite a long thing, so I'm not going to read it all out to you. But you can imagine that was really stirring up things. Suffice it to say that while it may have caused some interest at the time, this was quickly suppressed by the establishment of historians who clearly did not want their version of British history changed. And this is so true of academics. You know, I've come across this with Egyptology, I've come across it with this King Arthur stuff, I've come across it with other things, that when someone's, you know, got the high position, the high platform, he's the man, you know. They don't like to be shown things that prove that actually they got it wrong. Actually, they need to change their ideas in the light of this new evidence. They don't like that one little bit. You tell them that the pyramids represent the belt of Orion, they think they'll spread it about. He's a nutcase, you know, he's a New Age freak. He's a, forget that, they're just tombs. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to see that that might be the way to find out much deeper level of meaning and understanding of the culture. If you would only go down this, explore this avenue further, you might find out much more. No, we know everything already. It's just a question of dotting a few I's and crossing a few T's. That's, unfortunately, is the attitude of academics worldwide, and especially in sciences. Anyway, so things pretty much went back to sleep until Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett started stirring up the hornet's nest again in the 1990s. And I'm now continuing their work, but in my own way. I would like to add that it is also clear that Geoffrey's version is a flowery translation of the earlier Brut and not vice versa. This is made particularly clear because Geoffrey screws up certain names and proper nouns. The names, he makes them so he Latinizes them. So he makes Caswallon, for instance, who's the British leader at the time of Caesar's invasion. He's the High King at that time, and he's called Caswallon. In Geoffrey's version, it becomes Cassivellaunus. The US on the end and slight changing in the spelling to make it sound more Roman, more Latin. So he does that. But he mangles up other names terribly and gets them really screwed up, and either because his manuscript was defective or because he just didn't understand what he was doing. But anyway, he gets certain things completely messed up. And a good example of this is he refers to a king called Rudhud Hudibras, who founded Shaftesbury in Dorset. Right, he's son of someone called Leal, who he ascribes the founding of Carlisle to. Lyell's son, Rudhud Hudibras, reigned for 39 years after him. Once the Civil War was over, so the Civil War broke out, his father was old and couldn't control things properly. Hudibras restored peace once more to the people. It was he who built Caerhraint, that is Canterbury. I think that should have been Caercaint, but he calls it Caerhraint. He's mistaken a K for an R. He also founded Caergwynedd, or Winchester, and the fortress of Palador, which is now called Shaftesbury. There the eagle spoke while the wall was being built. We don't need to care about that. So he says that this Rudhud Hudibras built or set up the fortress of Shaftesbury. I used to live near Shaftesbury, so I know it very, very well. He refers to the Welsh for Shaftesbury is Caer Palador, or Castle of the Spear, i.e. sceptre. So Sceptersburg in English. In Geoffrey, there was no hint that this had anything to do with the name of the king who founded it. So Shaftesbury, or Sceptersburg in English, is the Castle of the Spear. Now, however, in the Tysilio version, he's called Ron Palador Vras, which means spear with a thick shaft. So this guy is called Ron Palador Vras, the spear with a thick shaft. So you can see that Shaftesbury is named after him. It's based on his name, Thick Shaftesbury. That he built that. He put that castle there. It's his castle, and it's very normal for cities to be named after their founders. So, in the Tysilio version, we can understand this. In the Geoffrey version, where he screws it up, we can see that there's no connection. So that rather militates against the idea that Geoffrey's book was translated back from the Latin into the Welsh and a précis done, removing all the flowery bits, to give us the Tysilio document, which is not as padded out as Geoffrey's book is, in Welsh. It must be the other way round. So that was another point that needs to be made here. Another case in point is the name of Arthur's famous sword. Yeah, you've all heard of Excalibur, yeah, but in Geoffrey it's called Caliburn, yeah, and Caliburn is thought to mean, meaning it came out of Cali, somehow connected with iron, and burn, well, that's like a Scottish word burn, meaning a bourne or stream. So it's because it's come out of the stream, the iron out of the stream. Excalibur, X out of the Caliburn, Excalibur. So that's how people work that out based on Geoffrey. But it's not called that in Tysilio, and it's not called that anywhere else in the Welsh texts. It's called Calidfwlch. And this means something entirely different. It means the hard cleft, Calidfwlch. And that is a clear indication that this sword was made of very, very hard, tough steel. So much so that it would cleft things. It would cleft other swords. It would cleft heads. That's why it's invincible, this sword. It's so strong, it's so powerful that it defeats all others. And probably, I think, it was made using the technique we call now pattern welding. We particularly associate that with the Vikings. But maybe this was actually invented originally in Wales. And they say in Geoffrey's version, it says he got this sword in Glastonbury. It doesn't say that in the Tysilio version. It says it came from Aberlach. And Averlach was, and I've written books on this, so you can research this for yourself or read my books. But Aberlach was actually the area of Glamorgan around Coity, and including the mountain of Monachagaia and Llanillid and the Whiten Stream, the Owenny River, all that area there. And on top of Monachagaia, Alan told me they found pits up there of old iron workings. So there would have been people actually making iron. And remember, Wales was full of coal. And I don't believe that these people hadn't discovered this black rock. If you put it on a fire, it catches fire and gives a very good heat. I'm sure people knew that from long, long ago. And Wales, of course, was the major centre, along with Newcastle, for the excavation of coal. And we were exporting it all over the world and using it for making iron. There were 3 ironworks in Merthyr Tydfil alone. So you begin to see this connection between this idea of a very powerful steel sword being manufactured in Averlach and the probable location of Averlach being in South Wales, where there is iron, where there is coal to smelt it with. And the technique of pattern welding perhaps was invented there. So I'll leave that with you. There's something to think about, isn't it? I haven't got proof for that. But anyway, clearly Arthur's sword, which is considered magical, was made from very hard steel, perhaps pattern welded, for extra strength. It was made in Aberlach, which is not Glastonbury, but rather the Coity area of South Wales. Here there are the remnants of iron workings on Monachagaia, where Allen and Barham found the old church where Arthur is buried. And if you think, what? Old church where Arthur? Yeah, we'll be talking about that too in due course. There is much more like this, which we will come to in later programmes. I think that it is proven by scholars such as Flinders Petrie, as well as people like myself and my co-authors, that Geoffrey really did have access to an old book, and this contained a text identical with, or at least very similar to, the Brut Tysilio. And this is important, for it means that we do have a written record of the British history that goes back before the Roman period. For us, this is our Rosetta Stone. So just as the Rosetta Stone opened up the hieroglyphs for decoding the hieroglyphs of Egypt, and also a book by Bishop Diego Landa from Merida in Mexico. He's one of the Spanish bishops there. He burnt the books of the Maya. Maya had these amazing bark books, and they wept. He made them put them all on the fire, except for 4 that survived, mainly because they'd been sent as presents to Europe. But he did record in his own book something about how their writing worked, and that, believe it or not, as late as the 1950s, no one had thought of this, and it was actually a Russian scholar who used this information to begin the process of decoding the Mayan language, the Mayan scripts, and that's been worked on by scholars since. And the late 20th century, between about 1970 and the end of the century, was a major time in the deciphering of the Maya code and the Mayan scripts. I've written about that too in a couple of my books. So this could be for us, British and Americans. You're from us. You're part of our culture, our heritage. You're our offspring, like Canada and Australia and New Zealand. It could be the key to understanding more about our own culture and our own origins. And this, I think, was one reason why Petrie was so interested. And before I go, I'm going to show you one other thing. Way back in 1877, when Petrie was only 19, he carried out the first excavation works on Stonehenge, and he published it in this book. I have a reprint here of it, and he shows us, he provides his detailed drawings of Stonehenge of the time, and he measured the positions of the stones, he measured the lengths of them, he measured particularly the circle around the outside. He measured the inside of that circle, the middle of it, and the top of it, and and he carried out this, and he used these measurements. He had a special chain made so that he could do this measuring, and he did it very, very accurately. He's only 19, and he used this to work back what must have been the unit of measure, or the units of measure used at Stonehenge, and he found there were 2. The first one was what is known as the Phoenician cubit, and the second one is the Egyptian foot. Now, you can look those up in the Encyclopedia Britannica. You can probably find it on the internet if you poke around. But I think this is one of the major themes or driving forces of his whole life. He'd done this work. He found this anomaly, really. Why are the Brits using a Phoenician cubit and an Egyptian foot? And then he goes to Egypt. One of the first things he does there as a young man is to carry out a careful survey of Giza and the Great Pyramid using his chains. He does it again, and he's, I think, looking for the link between the Middle East and Britain. And actually, the Brut Tysilio, Geoffrey of Monmouth's history, point to what that link is. So I think he had got skin in the game, as you might say, and I think there was a lot more to this man that he actually made out. He had a whole private thing going on as well, and that was part of his motivation. So thank you very much for your time and your interest. I'm delighted if the new people coming along, please do subscribe to the channel. Consider becoming a Patreon, patreon.com/AdrianGGilbert will take you there. It only costs you £5 a month and you'll be helping me enormously with making more of these programs and making more of this work, because, you know, I've got to live as well. I'll put those other links into the commentary below, and give us a like, give us a tick, and I look forward to speaking to you again with the next one. Thank you again. Bye-bye.